Zones of altitude. There are zones of latitude and zones of altitude. To every mountain region both these pertain, resulting in a nice interplay of geographic factors. Every mountain slope from summit to Piedmont is, from the anthropo-geographical standpoint, a complex phenomenon. When high enough, it may show a graded series of contrasted complementary locations, closely interdependent grouping of populations and employments, every degree of density from congestion to vacancy, every range of cultural development from industrialism to nomadism. The southern slope of the Monte Rosa Alps, from the glacier cap at 4,500 meters to the banks of the Po River, yields within certain limits a zonal epitome of European life from Lapland to the Mediterranean. The long incline from the summit of Mount Everest, 8,840 meters, in the eastern Himalayas, through Darjeeling down to sea level at Calcutta, comprises in a few miles the climatic and cultural range of Asia from Arctic to tropic. Politico-economic value of varied relief. For the state, a territory of varied relief is highly beneficial, because it combines manifold forms of economic activity, a wide range of crops, areas of specialized production mutually interdependent. It induces a certain balance of urban and rural life, which contributes greatly to the health of the state. 1253 The steep slopes of Dai Nippon, fertile only under spade tillage, will forever ensure Japan the persistence of a numerous peasantry. For geological and geographical reasons, as from national motives, therefore, Japan will probably never sacrifice its farmer to its industrial class, as England has done. On the other hand, contrasted reliefs on a great territorial scale tend to invade political solidarity. Tidewater and Mountain Virginia were poor running mates for a century before the Civil War, and then the mountain region broke out of harness. Geographical contrasts made the unification of Germany difficult, and yet they have added to the economic and national strength of the empire. The history of Switzerland shows the high alpine cantons always maintaining a political tug-of-war with the cantons of the marginal plain, and always suffering a defeat which was their salvation. Relief and climate. The chief effect of a varied relief is a varied climate. This changes with altitude in much the same way as with latitude. Heat and absolute humidity diminish, generally speaking, as height increases, while rainfall becomes greater up to a certain level. The effect of ascending and descending currents of air is to diminish the range of temperature on mountain slopes and produce rather an oceanic type of climate. The larger and more uniform a climatic district, the more conspicuously do even slight elevations form climatic islands, like the Harz Mountains in the North German lowlands. A land of monotonous relief has a uniform climate, while a region rich in vertical articulations is rich also in local varieties of climate. 1254 A highland of considerable elevation forms a cold district in the temperate zone, a temperate one in the tropics, and a moist one in a desert or steppe. Especially in arid and torrid belts does the value of elevation for human life increase. Altitude zones of economic and cultural development. The highlands of Mexico, South America, and the Himalayan rim of India show stratified zones of tropical, temperate, and Arctic climate, to which plant, animal, and human life conform. The response is conspicuous in the varying density of population in the successive altitude zones. Central Asia shows a threefold cultural stratification of its population, each attended by the appropriate density, according to location and steppe, Piedmont, and mountain. The steppes have their scattered pastoral nomads, the Piedmonts, with their irrigation streams, support sedentary agricultural peoples, concentrated at focal points in commercial and industrial towns. The higher reaches of the mountains are occupied by sparse groups of peasants and shepherds, wringing from upland pasture and scant field a miserable subsistence. The same stratification appears in the Atlas Mountains, intensified on the southern slope by the contrast between the closely populated belt of the Piedmont and the wandering Tuareg tribes of the Sahara on the one hand, and the sparse Berber settlements of the Atlas Highlands on the other. The long slope of Mount Kilimanjaro in German East Africa descends to a coastal belt of steppe and desert, inhabited by Swahili cattle breeders. Its Piedmont, from 1,000 feet above the plain up to 2,400 feet, constitutes a zone of rich irrigated plantations and gardens, densely populated by peaceful folk of mingled Bantu and Hamitic blood. At 6,000 feet, where forest seas, are found the kraals, cattle, sheep and goats of the semi-nomadic Maasai of doubtful Hamitic stock, who raid the coastal lowlands for cattle, and purchase all their vegetable food from the tillage belt. 1255, see maps page 105 and 487. Density of population in Italy. Density of population in Italy. This stratification assumes marked variations in the different geographical zones. In Greenland, life is restricted to the Piedmont coastal belt. Above this rises the desert waste of the icefields. Norway shows a tide-washed Piedmont, containing a large majority of the population. Above this, a steep slope sparsely inhabited, and higher still, a wild plateau summit occupied in summer only by grazing herds or migrant reindeer laps. Farther south, the Alps show successive tiers of rural economy, again with their appropriate density of settlement. On their lower slope is found the vineyard belt, a region of highly intensive tillage, large returns upon labor, and hence of closely distributed settlement. Above that is the zone of field agriculture, less productive and less thickly peopled. Higher still is the wide zone of hay farming and stock raising, supporting a sparse, semi-nomadic population and characterized by villages which diminish with the altitude and cease beyond 2,000 meters. On Etna, located in the tropical Mediterranean, three girdles of altitude have long been recognized: the girdle of agriculture, the forest belt, and the desert summit. But the tourist who ascends Etna passes from the coast through a zone of orange and lemon groves, which are protected by temporary matting roofs against occasional frosts, then through vineyards and olive orchards which rise to 800 meters, then through a belt of summer crops rising to 1,550 meters, and varied between 1,400 and 1,850 meters elevation by stretches of chestnut groves, whose green expanse is broken here and there by the huts of the forest guards, the highest tenants of the mountain. From these lonely dwellings down to the sea, density of population increases regularly to a maximum of over 385 to the square mile, 150 to the square kilometer, near the coast. Altitude and density belts in tropical highlands. In the tropical highlands of Mexico, Central and South America, on the other hand, concentration of population and its concomitant cultural development begin to appear above the 2,000-meter line. Here are the chief seats of population. Mexico has three recognized altitude zones: the cold, the temperate and the hot, corresponding to plateau, high slopes in coastal Piedmont up to 1,000 meters or 3,300 feet, but the first two contain 9/10 of the people. While the plateau has in some sections a population dense as that of France, the lowlands are sparsely peopled by wild Indians and lumbermen. Ecuador has 3/4 of its population crowded into the plateau basins, mean elevation 8,000 feet or 2,500 meters, enclosed by the ranges of the Andes. Peru presents a similar distribution, with a comparatively dense population on a plateau reaching to 11,000 feet, 3,500 meters, or more, though its coastal belt, being healthful, dry, and fairly well supplied with irrigation streams from the Andes, is better developed than any other similar district in tropical America. 1256 in Bolivia, 72% of the total population live at an altitude of 6,000 to 14,000 feet, while 5 out of the 9 most densely peopled provinces lie at elevations over 11,000 feet. 1257, see map page 9. From Mexico to central Chile, the heavy rains from the trade winds clothe the slopes with dense forests, except on the lee side of the high Andean wall of Peru and Chile, and reduce much of the Piedmont to malarial swamp and jungle. The discouragement to primitive tillage found in the unequal fight with a tropical forest, the drier, more bracing and healthful climate of the high intermontane basins, their favorable conditions for agriculture by irrigation, and their naturally defined location stimulating to early cultural development, all combined to concentrate the population of prehistoric America upon the high valleys and plateaus. In historic times these centers have persisted, because the civilized or semi-civilized districts could be best exploited by the Spanish conquerors and especially because they yielded rich mineral wealth. Furthermore, the white population which has subsequently invaded tropical America has to a predominant degree reinforced the native plateau populations, while the imported Negroes and mulattoes have sought the more congenial climatic conditions found in the hot lowlands. Increasing density with motive of protection. The relativity of geographical advantages in different historical periods warns us against assuming in all times a sparsity of population in mountains, even when the adjoining lowlands offer many attractions of climate and soil. In ages of incessant warfare, when the motive of safety has strongly influenced distribution of population, protected mountain sites have attracted settlement from the exposed plains, and thus increased the relative density of population on the steep slopes. The corrugated plateau of Armenia and Kurdistan, located on the uneasy political frontier of Russia, Persia, and Asiatic Turkey, exposed for centuries to nomadic invasion from the east, shows a sparser population on its broad intermontane plains than on the surrounding ranges. Security makes the latter the choicer places of residence. Hence they are held by the overbearing and marauding Kurds, latecomers into the land, while the older and numerically weaker Armenians cower down on the lower levels. 1258 Here is an inversion of the usual order. The militantly stronger intruders, with no taste for agriculture, have seized the safer and commanding position on the hills, descending in winter with their cattle and horses to pasture and prey upon field and granary of the valley folk, whose better soil is a questionable advantage. Motive of protection in primitive peoples. Instances of this sort, rare in modern times, because of general economic and social progress, multiply when we go into the history of primitive or ancient peoples. The Cherokee Indians of the southern Appalachians, surrounded by powerful neighbors in the Chickasaws, Creeks, and the encroaching whites of the seaboard colonies, attacked by war parties of Shawnees and Iroquois from the north, located the bulk of their nation in the mountains. The overt hill and middle towns, numbering together 33 and situated wholly in the mountains, comprised 4/5 of their fighting force in 1775, while the 9 towns distributed in the flat lands of Georgia and South Carolina were small and unimportant. The Indians themselves distinguished these 2 divisions of their country, the one as Otar or mountainous, and the others as airate or low. 1259 Similarly in ancient Gaul the 3 strongest tribes, the Sequani, Aedui, and Arverni, all had a large mountain nucleus. The Sequani held the Jura Range with part of the Saône Valley, the Aedui held the northeast corner of the Central Plateau and some lands on the Saône, while the Arverni inhabited the western and central portion of the same highland. In a period of constant tribal migrations and war, the occupants of these high, protected locations were better able to defend themselves, and they maintained an adequate food supply by holding some of the adjoining lowland. Archaeologists generally agree that in central and southern Italy settlement first took place in the mountains, gradually extending thence down into the plains. The superiority of the upland climate, the more abundant rainfall, the greater security against attack offered by mountain sites, and the excellent soil for agriculture resulting from the geological makeup of the Apennines, all combined to draw thither primitive and later settlement. 1260, see map page 559. Similarly in Britain of the Bronze Age, before the peoples of Aryan speech began to swarm over the island, the primitive inhabitants, involved in constant clan or tribal warfare, placed their villages on the hills, and left in the indestructible terraces on their slopes the evidences of a vanished race and an outgrown social order. 1261. Geographic conditions affecting density of mountain population. The advance of civilization, which brought the ancient pirate-ridden city from the inner edge of the coastal zone down to the wave-washed strand, also drew the hill town down to the plain, and the mountain population from their inaccessible strongholds to the more accessible and productive valleys. These facts contain a hint. The future investigation of archaeological remains in high mountain districts may reveal at considerable elevations the oldest and hence lowest strata of prehistoric development, strata which, in the more attractive valleys, have been obliterated or overlaid by later invasions of peoples and cultures. Ignoring this temporary attraction of population to protected mountain locations in ages of persistent warfare, we find that a comparison of many countries reveals a decreasing food supply and decreasing density of population, with every increase of height above a certain altitude. except in favored mining regions and in some tropical lands, where better climatic conditions and freedom from malaria distribute settlements far above the steaming and forest-choked lowlands. The density of population in mountains is influenced also by the composition of the soil, which affects its fertility, by the grade and exposure of the slopes, which determine the ease and success of tillage, by the proximity of the highlands to teeming centers of lowland population, and by the general economic development of the people. In Great Britain, the sparsest population is found in the sterile Highland moors of Scotland, where the county of Sutherland has only 11 inhabitants to the square mile, Inverness only 20.1262. These figures reveal also the remoteness of a far northern location. In the southern half of the island, the sparsest populations are found in the Welsh county of Radnor, with 49 to the square mile, and in English Westmoreland with 85, both of them mountain regions, but reflecting in their larger figures their close proximity to the teeming industrial centres of South Wales and Lancashire respectively. In France, the most thinly settled departments are Basses Alpes with 43 to the square mile and Hautes Alpes with 50, which again owe even these figures in part to their situation on the margin of the densely populated valley of the Middle Rhone. See map page 559. Norway, almost wholly a mountain country, averages only 18 souls to the square mile. Less than 1,000 square miles of its territory are under cultivation, and these are distributed in small deltas at the heads of the fjords, in low strips here and there along its western coasts, or in the openings of its mountain valleys to the southeast. Here too is massed the larger part of its inhabitants. A barren granitic soil, unfavorable zonal location, excessive rainfall, paucity of level land, leaving the upright farm predominant, and remoteness from any thickly settled areas, together with the resulting enormous emigration, have combined to keep down Norway's population. Sparsity of population in the Alps. If we turn to Switzerland, a country poor in the resources of its land but rich in the resourcefulness of its people, we find a high average density, 218 to the square mile, but this is due to the surprising industrial development of the marginal plains, which show in the canton of Geneva 1356 to the square mile, and in Canton Zurich 705, while the rugged upland of Graubünden, Grisons, shows only 38 to the square mile, Uri only 48, and Wallis, Valais, only 59. How limited is the food supply of the country is evident from the fact that only 2,400 square miles, or 15% of its area, can be ranked as arable land, fit for garden, orchard, or grain field, while a larger proportion, or 28%, is made wholly useless by watercourses, glaciers, rock, and detritus. One half of the entire country lies above the region where agriculture is possible. In the cantons of Uri and Valais, more than half the area is absolutely unproductive, scarcely less in the Grisons, and a third even in sunny Ticino. 1263. The three strictly alpine provinces of Austria, Tyrol, Salzburg, and Carinthia reproduce approximately these geographic conditions. Nearly half of their area is uninhabited, and only 1/7 consists of arable land. In consequence, they support only 75 inhabitants to the square mile, while just outside the mountains, in the Piedmont or Alpine foreland, this density is doubled. 1264. Many tracts of the Carpathians, especially about the sources of the Thyssen Pruth and the wooded mountain borders of Transylvania, are among the most sparsely inhabited parts of Europe. 1265. Japan, ridged by steep volcanic ranges, drenched by mountain-borne rains, strewn with detritus from plunging torrents, can cultivate only 15.7% of its area, and is forced to leave 59% in forest reserves. 1266. Terrace agriculture. These figures tell of the hard conditions of life characteristic of most mountain regions. Population under normal circumstances settles in the narrow valleys between the ranges and along the borders of their drainage stream. Soon, however, the food supply becomes inadequate for the growing numbers, so that artificial means have to be employed to expand the area of arable land. The soil on the mountain slopes is so thin that it yields only a scanty return to the labor of tillage. Moreover, under the operations of plowing and harrowing, it is exposed to the danger of washing, so that after a few croppings the underlying rock of the mountainside may be laid bare, and all that was valuable in the quantum field deposited in the valley is silt or swept away to enrich the distant delta of the nearest trunk river. To obviate this difficulty and to secure the desired increase of arable land, mountain peoples the world over have resorted to terrace agriculture. This means hand-made fields. Parallel walls, one above the other, are constructed on horizontal lines across the face of the steep slopes, and the intervals between are filled with earth, carried thither in baskets on the peasants' backs. The soil must be constantly renewed and enriched by manure in the same way, and the masonry of the retaining walls kept in repair. Whenever possible, these costly terraced fields are located by preference on southward-facing slopes, where the tilt of the land makes the fields catch the rays of the sun almost at right angles and thus counteracts the chill of the higher altitude, while the mountain behind protects the growing crops from cold northern winds. Good arable land, being limited in amount, commands a high price, and especially do choice terraced fields in vine-growing countries, since they make the best vineyards. Such fields in Switzerland will bring from $300 to $2,000 an acre, and are estimated to produce annually 2 bottles of wine for every square foot. 1267. Geographical distribution. Terrace agriculture, rare in new countries, in the more densely populated Old World is widely distributed in mountainous areas. In Germany, where it is nearly identical with the culture of the vine, it is found along the steep slopes overlooking the valley of the Moselle and the Rhine, also in the Vosges Mountains, the Black Forest and the Swabian Jura, to the limited altitude in which the vine will flourish in these northern regions. In the Alps it is widespread, and not confined to the culture of the vine. The traveler passing along the upper Rhone through the sunny canton of Valais follows these terraced fields almost as far as Fiche, altitude 3,458 feet, beyond which agriculture proper becomes more and more restricted on account of the elevation, and passes rapidly into the mere haymaking of a pastoral community. Between Leek and Sierre, not only the mountainsides, but also the steep gravel hills constituting the old terminal moraine deposited by the receding Rhone glacier across the valley floor, are terraced to their very tops. Terrace cultivation prevails in the mountains of Italy. It is utilized not only for the vine, but for olives, maize, oats, hemp, rye, and flax. On the gentler declivities of the Apennines, the terraced walls are wider apart and lower than on the steep slopes of the Ligurian Apennines and along the Riviera of the Maritime Alps, where the mountains rise abruptly from the margin of the sea. 1268 Careful and laborious terrace cultivation has produced in Italy a class of superior gardeners. The Genoese are famous for their skill in this sort of culture. The men from the Apennine plateau of the Abruzzi readily find positions in the lowlands as expert gardeners. 1269. Terrace culture of the Saracens. The Saracens of Spain in the 10th century converted every mountain slope into a succession of green terraces. They built walls of heavy masonry, and brought water, loam, and fertilizing materials from great distances. The slopes of Granada back of Malaga and Almeria were covered with vineyards. Every foot of land susceptible of cultivation was turned to account, every drop of water from the ill-timed winter rains was conserved for the growing season. The application of intelligence and labor to tillage enabled the Hispano-Arab provinces to support a dense population. 1270 These Saracen cultivators had come from the severest training school in all Eurasia. Where the arid tableland of Arabia is buttressed on the southwestern front by high coast ranges, 6,000 to 10,500 feet or 2,000 to 3,200 meters, is Yemen, rich in its soil of disintegrated trap rock, adequately watered by the dash of the southwest monsoons against its towering ridges, but practically the whole country is a tilt. Consequently, the mountains have been terraced from the base often up to 6,000 feet. The country presents the aspect of vast agricultural amphitheaters, in which the narrow paths of ancient paving zigzag up and up through successive zones of production. Here is a wide range of fruits: oranges, lemons, figs, dates, bananas and coffee, then apricots, apples, plums, grapes, quinces, peaches, together with grains of various zonal distribution, such as millet, maize, wheat, and barley. The terrace walls are from 5 to 8 feet high, but toward the top of the mountains they often increase to 15 feet. Though laid without mortar, they are kept in perfect repair. Reservoirs filled with water from the 2 rainy seasons supply the irrigation channels. 1271 in the narrow valleys of the Nejd Plateau in central Arabia and on the mountain slopes of Oman are found the same irrigated gardens and terraced plantations. This laborious tillage underlay the prosperity of the ancient Sabaean monarchy of Yemen, as it explains the population of 35,000 souls who occupy the modern capital of Sana'a, located at an altitude of 7,600 feet, 2,317 meters, 1272. In the Himalayas. Turning eastward, we find terrace agriculture widely distributed in Himalayan lands. The steep mountainsides of the Vale of Kashmir are cultivated thus to a considerable height. The terraces are irrigated by contour channels constructed along the hillsides, which bring the water for miles from distant snow-fed streams. Their shelf-like fields are green with fruit orchards and almond groves, with vineyards and grain fields. 1273 The terrace slopes about the Himalayan hill station of Simla, elevation 7,100 to 8,000 feet, feed the summer population of English, who there take refuge from the deadly heat of the plains. The mountain sections of the native states of Nepal and Bhutan present the view of slopes cut into gigantic stairs, each step a field of waving rice kept saturated by irrigating streams from abundant mountain springs. Farther north, where Himalayas and Hindu Kush meet, terrace agriculture is combined with irrigation in the high Gilgit valleys, and farther still along the Mir Gash running down from the Pamir Dome, called the Hunza Valley. Here live the once lawless robber tribes of the Hunzas and Nagaras, whose conquest cost the British a dangerous and expensive campaign in 1892, but whose extensive terraces of irrigated fields and evidences of skillful tillage gave the whole country an appearance of civilization strangely at variance with the barbarous character of its inhabitants. 1274. In Tibet and China. North of the outer Himalayan range, near the sources of the Indus and Sutlej rivers in Ladakh or western Tibet, the same form of cultivation has been resorted to by the retarded and isolated Mongolian inhabitants. Here at an altitude of 11,000 feet or more, 3,354 meters, along mountain ranges of primitive rock yielding only a scant and sterile soil, terraces are laboriously constructed, their surfaces are manured with burnt remains of animal excrements, which must first serve as fuel in this timberless land before they are applied to the ground. In this stronghold of Buddhism, almost every lamasery has its terraced fields yielding good crops of grain and fruit. 1275 In the densely populated Sichuan province of western China, cultivation has climbed from the fertile basins of the Min and Upper Yangtze rivers far up the surrounding mountains, where it is carried on terraces to the foot of vertical cliffs. 1276 Farther north, where the mountain province of Shenxi occupies the rise of land from the Chinese lowlands to the central highlands of Asia, terraces planted with wheat or other grains cover the mountain slopes. 1277. In ancient Peru. Terrace tillage is rare in new countries of extensive plains, like the United States and Canada, where the level lands still suffice for the agricultural needs of the people, but in the confined mountain basins and valleys which made up the Incas' territory in ancient Peru, every available natural field was utilized for cultivation, and terraces brought the obstinate mountainsides under the dominion of the Andean peasant. They were constructed, 100 or more in number, rising 1,000 or 1,500 feet above the floor of the highland valley, contracting in width as they rose, till the uppermost one was a narrow shelf only 2 feet broad. These were extended by communal labor year after year, with increase of population, just as today in Java and the neighboring islands, and became the property of the Inca. Streams from the higher slopes were conducted in canals and distributed from terrace to terrace, to irrigate and fertilize. These terraces therefore yielded the best crops of potatoes, maize, and pulse. The cultivable area was further extended by floating gardens, consisting of rafts covered with earth, which floated on the surface of lakes. 1278 They existed in ancient Mexico also, 1279, and are used today in the lakes and streams of Tibet and Kashmir. 1280 In the rivers of overcrowded China. Terrace agriculture in mountainous islands. Mountainous islands, born of volcanic forces or the partial submergence of coastal ranges, have steep surfaces and scant lowlands. Their inhabitants command limited area at best. Driven to agriculture by their isolation, drawn to it by the favorable oceanic climate, such islands develop terrace tillage in its most pronounced form. On the precipitous pitch of Tenerife, every particle of alluvial soil is collected to make gardens. Long lines of camels, laden with boxes of earth, may be seen coming almost daily into the town of Santa Cruz, bringing soil for the terraces. 1281 This is desperate agriculture. Irrigated terraces scar the steep slopes of many Polynesian islands. 1282 They are highly developed among the Malay Batiks of Sumatra, especially for rice culture. 1283 In Java, Bali and Lombok they reach a perfection hardly equaled elsewhere in the world. In Java they begin at an altitude of 1,000 feet, cutting main and branch valleys into amphitheaters, and covering hundreds of square miles. 1284 On the volcanic slopes of Lombok the terrace plots vary from many acres to a few square yards, according to the grade, while a complete system of irrigation uses every brook to water the terraces. Here as in Java the work began at a very early period, when it was probably introduced among the native Malays by Brahmins from India. 1285 Japan, two-thirds of whose area is mountainous, has terraced its steep valley walls often up to 2,000 feet or more, and utilized every patch of ground susceptible of tillage. 1286 Among mountain savages. A mountain environment often occasions a forced development in the form of agriculture among peoples who otherwise still linger in a low stage of barbarism or savagery. The wild, head-hunting Igorots, inhabiting the cordilleras of north-central Luzon, have leveled the face of their mountains into a series of platforms, held by retaining walls from 20 to 30 feet high. On these they cultivate upland rice at an altitude of 5,000 feet. The Igorot province of Bontoc contains valleys in which every available foot of land is terraced for rice, and which present artificial landscapes vividly recalling Japan. Labor is the heritage of each inhabitant. Every man, woman and child down to 10 years of age shares in the work of providing food. 1287 Africa shows parallel cases. The Angos people, a savage Negro tribe who occupy part of the Murchison Range in northern Nigeria, have mapped out all their sloping land into little terraces, sometimes only a foot or two wide. One of their peaks, 4,135 feet high, has its plateau top covered with populous villages, owing to the protection of the site, and every inch of its slope cut into terraces planted with millet and Guinea corn. 1288 A more primitive form of this tillage is found in the country of the Marunga Negroes, who occupy the steep western face of the Rift Valley filled by Lake Tanganyika. Here Cameron found the surface not regularly terraced, but retaining walls of loose stones disposed at intervals, which served to hold the soil in place, without greatly altering the natural slope. The scene recalled the terraced heights of Switzerland, and the people working there looked like flies on a wall. 1289 In the semi-arid country of Sudanese Darfur, where only the mountain districts are well watered and thickly populated, small terraces for grain and melons cover all the slopes. 1290 Fertilizing. Mountain agriculture is necessarily laborious. The paucity of arable land precludes the possibility of letting fields lie fallow. These, to prevent exhaustion, must be constantly and abundantly fertilized, all the more as conditions of excessive subaerial denudation found in the steep slope and usual heavy rainfall of mountains, as well as possible glacial scouring of the land in the past, have greatly attenuated the layer of soil called upon to support plant life. The Swiss or Tyrolese farmer cherishes his manure pile as at once source and badge of his wealth. After harvest it is carted or carried in baskets not only to the terraces, but also to the wide alluvial fan that grows his oats and rye, to his meadows and hayfields. Both in Mexico and Peru the soil received a dressing of poudrette. Manuring was most extensive where population was densest, as in the isolated mountain valleys opening out upon the desert coast of Peru. Every kind of organic refuse was utilized, and fish was buried with the kernels of maize as a fertilizer. The deposits of guano found on the headlands and offshore islands were used from the remotest times. Different guano beds were assigned to the several provinces, and the breeding places of the birds were protected by law. 1291 Ashes and decayed wood were employed for the same purpose, or plants were dug into the soil, while human manure was in Mexico a marketable commodity as in China. 1292 Economy of level land for houses in villages. In all mountain regions where population has begun to press upon the meager limits of subsistence, level land and soil are at a premium. In ancient Peru, space was begrudged for the dead. 1293 Cities covered considerable space on the roomy intermontane plateaus, but in the narrow lateral valleys, houses and temples were built on rocks, in order to reserve every fertile spot for agriculture. 1290 For the traveler notices the same thing throughout the Alps. Compact villages cling to the mountainsides, leaving the alluvial hem of the stream or level glacial terrace free for the much-needed fields. Only in broad longitudinal valleys, like that of Andermatt, do the settlements complacently spread out their skirts, or on wide alluvial fans where transverse valleys debouch upon the plains. The mountaineers of the Crimea construct their houses against the precipices, excavating into their face and building up the front with stones, and thus reserve the gentler slopes for vineyards and gardens. 1295 In the Kangra, Kemong, and Garhwal districts of the British Himalayas, the large Indian villages of the plains give place to small hamlets or detached homesteads, scattered here and there wherever occasional patches of soil on a hillside or in a narrow valley offer hope of sustenance. These hamlets or dwellings are located on the sides of the mountains, because level spots which can be irrigated must be reserved for rice fields. 1296 The high site is also freer from malaria. Perpendicular villages. In the high Himalayan province of Ladakh or western Tibet, this principle of land economy reaches a climax. All settlement is on the perpendicular. The abrupt mountainsides are honeycombed with tombs, villages, and Buddhist lamaseries in the detached localities where population occurs. A pleasure walk through one of these Tibetan towns means a climb by steep flights of steps hewn out of the rock, varied by a saunter up ladders, where the sheer face of a cliff must be surmounted to reach the houses on a ledge above. 1297 Pictures of these recall forcibly the cliff dwellings of the Pueblo Indians. Even the important market city of Le covers the lower slope of the mountain at an altitude of 11,500 feet, and from its height overlooks the cultivated fields in the sandy valley bed below, made fertile by irrigating streams from debouching canyons. 1298 The Ladakh villages always shun the plains. The desire to economize level arable land does not alone dictate this choice of sites, however, the motive of protection against inundation, when the snows melt and the streams swell, and also, to some degree, against hostile attack, is an additional factor. In the mountainous parts of overcrowded China, again, the food problem is the dominant motive. In the rugged highland province of Shenxi, a village of several hundred people covers only a few acres, and rises in closely packed tiers of houses against the mountainside. 1299 In the wilder, half-conquered parts of Sichuan, the villages crown the lower peaks, cling to the base of the mountains, or are perched on ledges of rock overlooking the gorges. Among the steep cliffs bordering the upper Yangtze, occupied chiefly by the timid, displaced Mansa Aborigines, at an altitude of 10,000 feet, small platforms resting on beams projecting from the sheer mountain face support minute houses, whose backs burrow into the cliff behind. The small children are tied to the doorpost, to keep them from falling into the millet field below. The house is accessible only by bolts driven into the cliff. Above and below is the farm, small patches of tilled soil, often not larger than a bath towel, to which the cultivator lowers himself by a rope. 1300 Here life hovers on the brink of death and despair. Mountain pastures and stock raising. Paucity of arable land in mountain regions leads to the utilization of the untillable slopes for stock grazing. This industry is always a valuable ally to mountain agriculture on account of the manure which it yields, but in high altitudes, where the steepness or rockiness of the soil, cold and the brevity of the growing season restrict or eliminate cereal crops, it becomes the dominant occupation of the inhabitants, while agriculture takes a subordinate place, limited to the production of hay and fodder for the winter feeding of the stock. Above the line of tree growth flourish the natural summer pastures up to the border of perpetual snow, and just below lies a zone which, if cleared of its forests, supports a thick carpet of grass and herbage, though too cold to ripen grain. The high pastures are particularly nourishing. Cows feeding here in the Alps give better milk than the home or valley cows, though a smaller quantity. Sheep and goats do equally well, but swine are profitable only as a byproduct, to utilize the refuse of the cheese and butter industry. The area of these pastures far exceeds that of arable land in mountain regions. In Switzerland they comprise about 27% of the total productive area, hay meadows 24%, but fields and gardens only 20%. 1301 in the Austrian province of Salzburg, pastures make up 13.3%, hay meadows 34.5%, and tilled fields only 11.7% of the total productive area. In the Tyrol the figures are much the same. 1302 Since Norway has over 67% of its total area in bare mountains, snowfields, bogs and lakes, it is not surprising to find only 7.6% in pastures, 2.2% in meadows, and 0.7% in grain fields. But here the pastures are 10 times the arable area. 1303 The season of the summer feeding on the grasslands is short. In the so-called High Alps it frequently lasts only 6 or 7 weeks, in the Grisons at most 13 weeks. 1304 and in Norway from 2 to 3 months. 1305 High mountain regions, practically restricted to this grasswirtschaft, soon reach their maximum of prosperity and population. The amount of hay secured for the winter feeding limits the number of cattle, and the number of the cattle, through their manure, fixes the valley hay supply. Alpine pastures cannot be enlarged, and they may be reduced by accidents of nature, such as landslides, devastating torrents, or advance of icefields or glaciers. They cannot be improved by capital and labor, and they may deteriorate chemically by exhaustion. The constant export of butter and cheese from alpine pastures in recent times, without substitution by any fertilizer beyond the local manure, has caused the diminution of phosphoric acid in the soil and hence impoverishment. Canton Glarus has shown a steady decline since 1630 in the number of cows which its mountain pastures can support. 1306 Many other alpine districts show the same deterioration.